Yes, give me 1 second. I'm just putting everything together.
Yes, yes, yes. Take your time, take your time.
Okay, perfect. Just let me know when you would like me to start. Would you like me to turn my video on, or?
Yes, you can turn on your video.
Okay.
So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So shall we get going? I think quite a many have logged in, and we are
Okay.
also on YouTube Live. So some may be watching us there too.
Okay, that's
That
fine.
is our college media.
Okay.
Dr. Fahmida, who's also a course coordinator. Have you logged in, Dr. Fahmida?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Good evening, ma'am. Good evening.
Please switch in
Mr.
your.
Thank you. Good
You
evening.
can enable your video, and some of the students, it would be good if you could enable your video for a while, so that we can get to see you. And once the presentation begins, maybe we can switch off. So greetings from the PG Research Department, CTTE College, all the way from India. So it is good evening for us and good morning to you, Mr. Praveen. So it must have been an early morning for you.
Yes.
So this is part of our course Introduction to American Literature, undergraduate students, final students, penultimate semester. In fact, they have done part of this course in the previous semester. So that is why this particular lecture is designed to take care of the post-World War American history.
Okay.
So just as a kind of a preface to our session today, as we all know, understanding history helps us to understand the world at large. And understanding literature reveals the culture and history of a country. So in every sense, the two are intertwined, right? And that explains why the course Introduction to a paper on American literature should be from the realms of history. So literature, when explored along with the facts from history, will help us to become more knowledgeable, more perspectives would improve, and of course make us a lot more intelligent too. So when you learn about forces, individuals, trends and events that shape the present, you will be able to discover the power of novels, poems, plays and stories. In short, history and literature are the essential studies of the humanities because they interpret for us the human experience. So this would be an opening statement that I would like to make and justify why I have called in Mr. Siddharth Praveen to our midst to give us a course introduction. At the outset, a big thank you from all of us, Mr. Praveen. We truly appreciate the spontaneous acceptance. He asks no questions, and that itself explains the passion he has for the subject. And I stand encouraged by your passion, and I'm sure the students who are listening will also be. I've already spoken about you to my students, and once again to give a formal introduction, Mr. Siddharth Praveen has Indian origins, but has been there in the US, did all his studies there. His parents and grandparents apparently have been immigrants, and he's presently pursuing his master's in history at the University of Central Florida. And in fact, in my conversations, he was telling me that his greater interest lies in medieval English history, which also sounds extremely interesting. So thank you, Mr. Praveen, for waking up so early for us and putting up with all the inconvenience, and we are looking forward to an excellent session from you.
Of course.
The stage is yours.
Of course, thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Siddharth Praveen. I'm going to be doing the lecture today for American history in the post-World War. So I guess we can get started then. Give me a second. Okay, so a little bit about my background. As Dr. Thomas said, I graduated from Florida Atlantic University with a Bachelor of Arts in History, and I'm currently a postgraduate doing my Master of Arts in History at the University of Central Florida. I also specialize in medieval England. The thesis that I'm currently writing is how Anglo-Saxon culture survived during the 12th century between the years 1066 and 1200 after the Norman conquest, in which England had a more, England until that time had more ties with Scandinavia, which is modern day Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, but then after 1066 began to focus towards mainland Europe and had more interactions with France, Germany, and so on and forth, and that would actually shape European politics for centuries to come. So that's my intention is to, since a lot of primary source literature has mostly been focused on the upper class nobility, my intention is to focus on the lower classes who still retain their native Anglo-Saxon roots and still have Scandinavian influence within them that survived even after this time period and would continue until the year 1200. That said, I guess we can start with the session. Just let me know, is Dr. Thomas, are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Excellent. Okay, so America's position after the Second World War was in a very unique place because until this time, you know, the U.S. was not a country that was very involved in geopolitical events. Usually the powers that called the shots were the British Empire, the Russian Empire, Austria-Hungary, which for a time actually had been known as the Holy Roman Empire, but then they dissolved that name in around the early 19th century. And then, of course, France, which actually contributed a lot. The French Revolution did to the political spectrum in today's political discourse. So after the Second World War ended, America was in a very interesting position. It had actually emerged as the most powerful country in the world, only to be rivaled by the Soviet Union. So you have these two incredible geopolitical countries that basically had unexpectedly become fierce rivals in many ways. You know, with the U.S. championing capitalism and then the Soviet Union championing communism. And this rivalry actually would start what became known as the Cold War, which actually would keep going all the way until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So one of the reasons I talked about this is because of the US dollar and why this happened during this period. Now, before we go to I will start talking about America's rise in the post-World War, I just want to give a brief overview, background of the Great Depression. So in 1929, during the presidency of Herbert Hoover, I believe there was a big stock market crash due to the fact that massive consumerism had been going on because many of these customers and other Americans and other individuals had been buying solely based on credit and nothing to pay it back with. And that period is known as the Roaring 20s. It was a very unusual period in terms of culture and media and everything. But then after the stock market crashed, everything completely changed. There was massive poverty. It is one of the biggest blunders and dark points in American history overall. However, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR, came to power, and he immediately began to institute a series of reforms. Roosevelt focused on the 3 R's, which were relief, reform, and recovery. Relief was to give relief to the burdened poor classes, the working class, who had suffered the most and become mainly destitute from this. The next was to reform the overall political and economic system to make sure this would never happen again. And finally, recovery, to rehabilitate the overall U.S. economy and make it much more world power. I didn't include a lot of things of what FDR did, but one of the things he did do is passed in 1935. He created thanks to Congress, because the Democratic Party had massive massive numbers and had super majorities basically during this time, they were able to create something called Works Progress Administration Act, which was focused on improving infrastructure. They built schools, dams, bridges, roads, and a lot of things like this was important for the overall rise of the American economy. So it really helped also to solidify the notion of, oh, capitalism is a very successful experiment, and FDR's reforms were primarily part of that. So after the Second World War, we were in a very unique situation. So the main reason owing to one of these rises was something called the rise of the US dollar. Now the US dollar, so until this time, until this time, the reserve currencies were usually held by the British pound. Now, what a reserve currency is that it's the global currency in which countries, nations around the world use for trade, whether it comes to gas, oil, commodities, or anything else. The reserve currency is used to trade with several of these countries, and that actually helps bring up the specific currency's value. Until now, it had been, until 1945, it was actually the British Empire that actually had been the one who had been the dominant reserve currency, one of the reasons they became the most powerful country, one of the largest empire the world had ever seen. However, by the 19th century, they were on a massive decline, both problems at home, colonial revolts from several of its from overseas territories, actually created a massive strain on the empire. So by the early 20th century, the British started actually borrowing massive amounts of loans from the Americans. In fact, America's economy surpassed the U.S. The British economy by 1871. So because of this, the U.S. eventually became what we call creditors. Basically, it became a major creditor for the British Empire. So after World War II ended, the British Empire was completely in a wreck. It had no money. It was devastated by the Second World War, especially 1940 Battle of Britain with Hitler's Nazi Germany. It ended up winning, but at a large cost. But the U.S. had managed to survive and become economically and militarily very powerful. As a result, its leaders, eventually, FDR had passed away at this point, but his successor, Harry Truman, and presidents who followed him, eventually realized that the isolationist policy that the U.S. had basically been enjoying from its establishment was not the way to go now. And because of these incredible advantages, the U.S. began to position itself as the dominant geopolitical entity, only to be rivaled by the Soviet Union, and was determined to spread what it called capitalism and prevent a Second World War basically from happening. And of course, another important thing is that America, the U.S., was also, thanks to FDR's rehabilitation in the 30s, was able to turn the U.S. into a major manufacturing hub, and a lot of its and as a result, American products actually made up 1/3 of the exports in the world. And of course, American gold reserves were also, and global gold reserves were also by this time held by 2/3 of the dollar, which also made it an important commodity. At the same time, the British Empire, basically collapsed. The process of decolonization happened. Several countries such as India, Canada, Australia, and others, overseas territories became independent after 45. So that also contributed to the decline of the empire, the U.S. empire, the British Empire as a dominant geopolitical entity, and it was reduced to a regional power after the famous Suez Canal crisis of 1956. In which the U.S. actually had played a massive role in. So one of the main ways that America decided to use that geopolitical influence was to establish what we call the United Nations. So this was established in 1945 in San Francisco. It was actually inspired by President Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, which was supposed to create a massive network and coalition of countries to prevent global wars from happening, because World War I was also pretty devastating. In fact, led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. And President Wilson wanted to prevent something like that from happening. But unfortunately, because of politics at home and also a strenuous relationship with, let's say, the Japanese, who also played a role in the overall conflict in the First World War on the side of the Allies, it never was able to go through. But his ideas never did die out. So what the Americans did is they took that League of Nations and they basically gave it a tweak, and what we call today the United Nations was officially born. Another important plan was the rehabilitation of Europe overall. So Europe had been devastated. Millions of people were dead. Economies have been completely beyond repair. A good example would be Germany, for example, have been divided due to Hitler's suicide and the Nazi leadership's complete collapse, with the two European powers, Britain, France, and then the US occupying one, which became known as West Germany, and the other side was known as East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviet Union as what we call their own kind of influence. So this is where the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US truly began. In fact, today's famous military alliance, NATO, was actually created in response to the Soviet Union's hegemony, and they created the Warsaw Pact in retaliation, and this would actually last all the way until the Soviets collapsed. So one of the ways that the US decided to use its newfound dominance to affect change is to come up with a Marshall Plan, which was spreading capitalism, containing communism, at the same time, however, building many markets within Europe, and also extending its influence politically and militarily sometimes over several of these countries. This helped it become an important leader, and it also led to the rise of the famous consumer society, and middle-class Americans became very, very wealthy as a result. So America in the post-war, however, despite this, there were a lot of problems. We were still over a decade away from the civil rights movement. Minorities still suffered from massive hardship, especially African Americans, because they had seen a lot of these jobs and benefits that the U.S. was given to more white working class people opposed to themselves. In fact, a good example of this is the famous car company General Motors only employed 67 African American workers out of the 11,125, and this was among the many difficulties that the minorities overall experienced. It was not just African Americans, but also Asian Americans and so on and forth. However, because America at the time was still a white majority country, they still experienced an economy boost, and the consumer society's rise led to many other enterprises and fields being created, such as the agribusiness, meat industries, with the rise of all these fast food restaurants and so on and forth in the 50s, and just begin to increase in massive amounts. The problem is that a lot of these companies and corporations usually depended on cheap labor, sharecroppers, which were former slaves that had been granted freedom, but they didn't have the financial means to become more independent from a lot of their former plantation owners, so they just stayed there and were paid a very low wage. And of course, migrant workers were also employed from out of the country. In fact, we see that as a major trend today in many countries, with the U.S. having a lot of its companies actually having their factories not in the U.S. but in places like China and so on and forth, which itself helped China become a major manufacturing country, and is in fact the second largest economy in the world today as a result. So the so-called family wage that was going on. So by 1960, right, middle-class families were very well off. They were earning between, at the standards at the time, between $5,000 and $10,000 a year. And however, the stereotyping of the nuclear family became very important during this time, because it was generally expected that in this familiar society, which played a big role in shaping the culture and stereotypes of the 1950s, is that the father was supposed to be the main breadwinner, while the mother was supposed to stay home and do all the other household chores and not work at all. Which is pretty ironic, because actually during the Second World War, female workers played a major role in manufacturing especially when it came to weapons and running factories and so on and forth, because the men were away fighting in the battles overseas, right? So, however, women still did want to maintain their rights. As a result of some manufacturing areas, such as electrical manufacturers, did rely on female workers. And at the same time, there were also important reforms that were implemented during this period, such as paid employments, and there were also important movements for equal pay, and these were praised by many famous individuals, such as Betty Friedman. Another important thing is that because of the economic stability and growth that the US was enjoying, there was a massive population boom, which is known as the baby boom. And this, in fact, reinforced the stereotypical nuclear family trope that was taking place in the 50s and later in the 60s. Another important thing that overall helped with spreading American culture overseas was entertainment and mass culture. Because the families were now very, very well off, they also were able to buy things that were, let's say 20 years ago, were like not 20 years ago in our time, but 20 years ago during that time, like in the 30s and the 20s, were considered to be luxuries, such as the TV or the radio, which had exploded in turn as communication began to increase. Mass media was an important fact in shaping American culture. Famous shows from the 50s, such as I Love Lucy, completely changed the landscape. And of course, Disney began to emerge as a major power. Actually, they started with their first production movie, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was released in 1937, and then just began to increase after that, and played an important role in shaping the American culture overall. And this not only happened in the US, but this was also able to establish American culture in other countries, third world, and so on forth, which saw the US as this shining beacon on a hill. And America was an example that many countries wanted to follow and emulate. However, as I said before, there were many discriminations. One of the examples is minorities were suffering heavily. As African Americans also suffered, the LGBT community also suffered heavily during this time period. For example, gay people were not even allowed to serve in the military. They had a lot of problems finding work. It was a big taboo during this time period. And if you were perceived to be gay, your life was basically ruined at that point. There was also massive persecutions against perceived homosexuals, and arrests and so on forth, such as charges of decency. But gay culture, the LGBT culture, still managed to thrive and actually continued to be a pulp fiction. Important books such as Odd Girl and Third Sex were bestsellers, and of course, the father of computer science, Alan Turing, was also a gay man. Although he's from Britain, but he also played an important role in shaping the culture and growth and political sphere of the world globally. So, as African Americans were suffering heavily during this time period, they really wanted to find a way to change that, and they were heavily inspired by Gandhi and the Indian independence movement of disobedience and nonviolence. So, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. played an important part in this. He did incredible organizing. And ultimately, the nonviolent resistance they did eventually led to the passing of the 1965 Civil Rights Act. At the same time, there was also heavy segregation in schools, which eventually led to the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education. That eventually would accelerate desegregation on the national scale, and this also completely helped the U.S. change for the better. Another important policy for the U.S. was its foreign policy. Now, America's foreign policy was very, very important during the Cold War, which signifies, as I said before, the famous rivalry between the Soviet Union and the U.S. After supplanting the British Empire in terms of foreign policy, the British Empire still did maintain a lot of influence, although these days, like during this time period, it usually did it in tandem with the U.S. America was still unexperienced during this time on the global stage, but one of the ways it was able to exert this influences was through the many coups and regime changes it did around the world. Despite the fact, the U.S. has claimed in the past that we only care about democratically elected countries. Many of the regimes they overthrew were democratically elected countries due to the fact that those countries did not agree with their interests. Those countries didn't fall in line when the U.S. wanted them to, did not share their resources with them, which was one of the ways that the U.S. economy was thriving on. So the first true example of this came in 1953 in Iran, where the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown due to the fact that the British Petroleum, which actually had maintained ties in Iran for over a century at this point, was against the Mossadegh government nationalizing oil so that all countries, regardless of where they're from, would be able to have equal share because they wanted a monopoly for themselves. So the MI6 made a deal with the CIA and they overthrew this government and installed a U.S. puppet government, which led to massive austerity and incredible suffering for the Iranian people which would be one of the factors in the 1979 revolution and the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is now today in a massive, loggerheads with the U.S. due to the fact the latter also has imposed sanctions on it. But this was one of the many examples. Another example was in Chile, where the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende was overthrown, and then the famous notorious dictator Augusto Pinochet was installed as a U.S. puppet. He's known for massive war crimes and terrible acts of cruelty against his subjects, and is regarded as today by modern historians and the public globally as a despot. And of course, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, are among the many places that the U.S. has been involved in terms of foreign policy. Two other notable exceptions would also be the Forgotten War, also known as the Korean War, which is, as a result, today two distinct countries in the same peninsula exist, North Korea and South Korea. And then the other one, which was more of a failure, which was the Vietnam War, which the U.S. ultimately withdrew its forces in 1973. But it still was successful in the long run in maintaining global hegemony influence over many of these global South countries. Another important thing was the realignment of several parties. So in this, I'm just going to mainly mention the Republican Party. Because the Republican Party, which had been established in 1854 and was the party of Lincoln, was a very progressive party for its time. Before this famous realignment, the conservatives of today's Republican Party were actually in the Democratic Party. And the liberal, progressive, whatever term you want to use them, the center-left faction was actually in the Republican Party. That's how it was originally formed. When slavery was abolished and the radical Republican period after the Civil War, which wanted to institute equal rights for all Americans, regardless of where they came from, took place in the Republican Party. There was a massive realignment. It actually started back in the 30s with Roosevelt's massive reforms, in which a lot of working class people, especially people of color, began to shift towards the Democratic Party. At the same time, many of these Democrats who felt alienated because of their conservative, racist beliefs at the time, were in fact deciding to shift towards the Republican Party. So it actually started with the 1964 campaign of Barry Goldwater, which started the official trajectory of the Republican Party shifting, right? And of course, you can see here Barry Goldwater and also future President Ronald Reagan, who played a major role in the 80s, and it's also very beloved, and was one of the most influential presidents in American history, also played a big role in this. Another individual who also played an important role in this was Richard Nixon, who started what we call the Southern Strategy, in which Dixiecrats, which were the right-wing Democrats of the Democratic Party, were eventually recruited and assimilated into the Republican Party. So throughout the 60s and 70s, this political realignment between the two parties began to shift until basically the Republican Party of the 19th century, of 1854, the party of Lincoln, was almost unrecognizable and was more similar to the Democratic Party that of notorious individuals such as John C. Calhoun and other individuals that were responsible, that played major roles in the build-up to the American Civil War. And then we have the Democratic Party, which was now the champion of the working class, the liberal, leftist, union working movements. However, this also began to change as the Democratic Party, I would say, slowly began to lose touch with its overall base. It actually happened during the 90s, during the reign of during the term of President Bill Clinton, who was the 42nd president of the United States. Bill Clinton did a lot of bipartisan acts. One of these examples was the welfare was to join hands with the conservative Republicans who were more corporate oriented, who were more beholden to corporations and cared more about big business, to reform welfare, and this also was very negatively impacted for the African American community, who were already suffering from massive underfunding and other systemic issues. It was also during his time that the 1994 crime bill was also passed, which is considered by many individuals to be one of the reasons for the massive incarceration and systemic challenges that minorities are facing today. Despite this, the overall unemployment level was actually only at 5% towards the end of Bill Clinton's term in 2001. However, the lower classes still suffered from unemployment, were not able to find good works, especially those who had been in prison for minor offenses, were not able to find any work, and employers would be very reluctant to hire them, if not hire them at all. This, along with tax cuts for wealthier families, also widened the wealth gap between many of these countries, so between the very wealthy and the middle class and the poor, and that's actually still a problem that's pursuing even to today. And of course, the unemployment level at 5% was only temporary, and it would fluctuate from time to time. And there are a lot of challenges that we're still having even to today. So even though, overall, America has enjoyed massive economic stability for the last 70, 80 years, there are still major challenges in our society that need to be solved today by the UN, in the American society that need to be solved today, and we still have a lot of work to do. So, are there any questions? Anybody would like? So now in the Q&A section, does anybody have any questions?
Yes, those who have questions can ask. As they gear up for questions, I was just wondering, it is said history repeats itself. So
True.
do you think we are moving into a scenario that was there in the 1930s in the US, like world over?
World over, it's complicated. I would say probably. At the same time, I don't know. We're still we haven't reached because the Great Depression happened in 1929, right? And now we're in 2022, 92 years away from between the two respective important years. But I haven't seen a point in which we have reached that period, because overall, even now, despite all the political events that are going on, such as the war in Ukraine and whatnot, the overall stability of the U.S. is still, geopolitically, is still pretty good. We're still, there's a lot of, domestically we have a lot of problems, but important things such as, like I mentioned in the lecture about the dollar being the major reserve currency, I don't think that's going to be changing anytime soon. So I don't think we have any problems yet. Anything could happen in the future. I feel like we're post 2016. I feel like we're living in a world in which in which there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know in what direction. It's difficult for political analysts, at least in my opinion, to predict in what direction something will happen. I myself cannot predict, because I'm a historian, and as a historian, my job is to study the past, not the future or the present. But based on political events, it remains to be seen what kind of world would be emerging. I would say the best answer to that is I don't know.
Okay, because as I was looking at the slide, and even those details about family that you had given, there is a lot of correlation between that and what is depicted in one of the plays that is prescribed for this, and that is The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams. I don't know if you've read it, it exemplifies the scenario that you were explaining. So perhaps the details or the actual happenings are different today, but the sensibility seems to be the same. This problem of unemployment and all that. And then again, what do you think about the present American society? I'm sure it is filled up a lot more with immigrants, right?
Definitely. So one of the, like I said, one of the things in the 1950s is that until recently, America was mainly a white-oriented country with many more of the white people. However, because of the influx of immigrants, in fact, Asian immigrants and Asian Americans are the largest growing demographic group, and by 2050 there will be more minorities, Indians, Indian Americans, Asian, Chinese Americans, African Americans, and so on and forth, more so than white Americans. So there's a big demographic shift that also has changed a lot of the politics, which I'm not very familiar with much in the U.S. overall. In terms of family, I would say the notion of the nuclear family, which was usually, the father is the breadwinner for the family. He's the one who funds the lifestyle or the life, like pays the bills, and the mother stays home. We don't see that anymore. And now it's usually women also work, and of course, LGBT families have also been rising a lot ever since same-sex marriage and other landmark cases. Oberfell versus Hodge, I believe, which was the Supreme Court case in 2015, also played a major role in shaping the family narrative. So it's very different from how it was back in the 50s. I would say many friends and other people that I have known personally have usually looked at that period in very disdain. They think that was a very backwards stereotype and time period, and not very inclusive enough for more for more immigrants and more minorities.
Thank you. Questions, please.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, I can enable your video. That will be better.
All right.
Is it possible? Otherwise, you can just ask.
Yeah. Okay. So I was thinking the same thing what Beena ma'am was talking about, like history repeating itself. I wanted to quote that either, and ask about how the situation in America is today compared to that. And you answered saying that demographically, like it's growing, and people are better, and people, accepting other, say, other cultures or other races, other genders more inclusively. It's grown since then. But then I've been partially, I don't know why I thought of posing this question, but then partially I've been following the Roe v. Wade case that recently just went against.
Yeah, it was struck down.
Yes. And do you think at that juncture, like you said, man was a breadwinner of the family and the female or the women were actually stereotypically made to stay inside the houses. Do you think this is again going backward in some case and the gender equality is something that is broken or taken apart? What is your opinion?
So that actually plays into the big role into, there was a big backlash, more like a conservative backlash. So like I said, as you know, when the Republican Party became a conservative party and it abandoned its working class progressive roots from the 1850s, it changed from the party of Lincoln and became basically the Democratic Party of the 19th century. What happened was they considered what happened was they wanted to use politics in a very, I would say, considered toxic way. There were a lot of movements and massive funding by many organizations that were created and lobbying, because unfortunately lobbying is a big thing in in Washington D.C. Usually a politician, a congressman, congresswoman, or a senator or vice president at times. Usually when their time in office was done, they usually go out, become lobbyists, join corporate boards and so on and forth. Many of them do that. Others join conservative think tanks which focus on policy. So in this case, what happened was the Republican Party was playing a long-term strategy. So after Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, they basically began to wage a long kind of war to elect more. They abandoned their efforts at legislation and focused more on areas such as the judicial system and focusing on the Supreme Court. And that's one of the ways that a lot of organizations such as the Federalist Society, Hudson Institute, and other conservative organizations were able to, during President Trump's years, they were able to install many conservative justices in the Supreme Court. They also mixed that with, the anti-abortion movement went from its true intentions, which was to control a woman's right to choose, to more of a caring about, the unborn, caring about life. The pro-life movement was more about caring about, thinking in the fact that the baby inside the mother's womb was in fact a live baby. There's a lot of nuance and discussion and debate based on that, but they believed that inception, from the minute of inception, life was born. That's how they framed that narrative, and they were able to attract a lot of people, a lot of followers to their causes. The Republican movement, especially during the Reagan years, it actually became much more stronger. I haven't looked deeply into the Reagan years, but definitely one of the things I do is pretty hypocritical. They claim to care about life, but once the baby's born, they don't care about the mother or the baby. So what they did was they pursued a long-term strategy in which, many Democratic presidents had several opportunities to codify Roe v. Wade, especially President Obama when he came to power in 2008. He had super majorities. Democrats controlled massive majorities both in the House and in the Senate, but because of infighting or because President Obama didn't prioritize codifying Roe v. Wade into official law rather than just relying on the overall Supreme Court case, it just stayed in limbo. Even presidents now even the current President Biden hasn't done much to codify abortion rights into law. Of course, the slim majority in the Senate and the House is to blame for that, but the Republican Party played a long-term strategy in which they decided to focus on the judicial branch, because America is governed by the legislative and judicial branches, right? So they focus on the judicial branch. So even if, let's say, Roe v. Wade had been codified, they would have the power to strike it down. Many politicians, from attorney generals to governors, started funding massive lawsuits. And of course, a lot of these organizations and think tanks, especially with the backing of conservative billionaires, and organizations began to fund a lot of lawsuits against many of these activists and many laws in many places that had passed abortion or wanted to legalize abortion. And ultimately, the Court of Appeals, they kept, even every time they lost the case, they kept appealing until it made its way to the Supreme Court. So President Trump was able to get 3 conservative justices. One of them, Robert Kennedy, retired, and that's how we got Brett Kavanaugh. And then Antonin Scalia, who was a conservative landmark firebrand, very well known in the Republican Party, very beloved, passed away in 2016. And even though President Obama wanted to put in Merrick Garland, the current U.S. Attorney General, the Republicans played, I would consider play dirty, and basically who had controlled the Senate at the time, refused to give Obama the ability to pass and allow Merrick Garland to become the next justice. He was more of a compromise. He was not the Supreme Court justice that the Democratic base desired. So after President Trump succeeded President Obama, he was the Republican-dominated Congress and Senate immediately put in Neil Gorsuch, and then which was handpicked by the Federalist Society, which was a major conservative think tank in Washington, and has a lot of influence in policy, and have been shaping policy for decades, especially since the Nixon years when Roe v. Wade and a lot of these other landmark cases were passed. They also use, and of course, due to the backlash and the failure of President Obama to achieve the many goals and objectives of the agenda that he had ran on during his 2008 campaign, Republicans were able to use that to create important movements such as the Tea Party movement. And once they swept into power in a lot of swing states, they took over the state legislatures and basically used gerrymandering, which is unfavorably making disproportionately disadvantaging a certain demographic group in order to gain more seats in Congress as much as possible. So using tactics like that was the ultimate goal in making sure Roe v. Wade was struck down. It was not a short-term thing. Unfortunately, activists and other individuals who had fought for Roe v. Wade only looked at it at the landmark case in the short-term strategy, while Republicans were playing a long-term strategy. They didn't decide, even though Roe v. Wade being passed in '73 was the first step, they didn't go the next step and codify that into law. So as a result, the Republicans decided to play a long-term game, and every time they got beat, they just kept getting back up. I'm using that figuratively. And basically, ultimately, they managed to succeed during the Biden presidency. Although, even if President Trump had been reelected, I think it would still happen regardless, because after Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a very well-known Supreme Court justice and beloved by the Democratic base, passed away, he was able to put in Amy Coney Barrett, who also is from the same class and background as the two other justices, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir. The session was so wonderful and it was very useful, but I have a doubt to ask to you.
Grace, can you enable your video, please?
Ma'am, I'm sorry, ma'am, there's no power here.
Fine. Tell him again.
Sir, what were the reforms that were brought in during Bill Clinton's period, and how do they affect the African Americans, sir?
For President Clinton, there were many reforms. One of the examples was, as I said, was the civil right, not the civil rights, sorry, was in fact, give me 1 second. One of the ways that it happened was because of one of the ways that it happened was due to, for example, the 1994 crime bill being passed. It was a good example. It was actually championed by, unfortunately, President Joe Biden when he was a senator from Delaware from 1973 all the way until the same year Roe v. Wade was passed, until he became vice president under President Obama. But it was but during that time, President Joe Biden, we still had a lot of conservative Democrats, and many of them are still very conservative today. Some of those politicians have been very slow to change their views, and unfortunately, the '94 crime bill was one of the major ways that African Americans were negatively impacted because of that passage of massive incarceration. African American communities have usually been very underfunded. They don't have access to good education and important they didn't have access to good standards of living. As a result, many of them usually turn to not very good lives and ultimately suffered from they were arrested and had massive criminal histories and records, and because of that, it was difficult for them to find jobs and make a living. So I believe that's one of the many ways that that they were impacted.
Hello,
Thank
Mr.
you, sir.
No problem.
Hello, Mr. Praveen. My question is, how did post-World War II affect America?
Affect America. So do you mean like domestically or internationally? I would like to, what do you mean by that, if you can clarify?
Internationally, how affected?
So internationally, it was, as I said before, it was the dominant nation in the world. It was a superpower. The status of superpower, which means like it is a country that's dominantly, militarily, economically, and financially superior to its to other fellow countries. And in this case, it was the U.S. because of the FDR presidency. He was the only president who was elected to 4 terms from 1933 until 1945. And because the dollar supplanted the U.S. pound, the British pound as a world reserve currency, that also played a big role in the U.S. being able to establish its hegemony over places like Europe and the West, and also global South countries as well. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that what do you call it? And also, that's one of the reasons that American culture became very prominent during the 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way until the Soviet Union ultimately fell in 1991 via the Cold War. Many nations sided with the U.S. because they believed the U.S. long-term wise was, in many eyes, was a democratically elected country. We're a democracy. We elect our leaders. We don't have authoritarian rulers like the Soviet Union did. As a result, and our brand of our economic models and brands were considered to be very popular. So that allowed many nations to side with us, and of course, supplanting the British Empire as well also gave it more prestige because the U.S. itself was also a former British colony. Any other questions?
Thank you, sir. I have another question.
Sure.
How did American economy change after the post-World War?
Economic change. So economy-wise, there weren't much changes. We still had many of the reforms that FDR had put in, such as Social Security and other important benefits. However, what happened was, as the years came by and as I talked about before, the political realignment of the Republican Party, the Reagan presidency, and Bill Clinton's presidency played big, important roles in this, is that they slowly began to find ways to cut Social Security and many important government programs that, the working class and lower and the poor and those who have been stricken in poverty have been relying on. So they slowly began to chip away at that and give more preference to big business. So companies like Disney, like Apple and all these, some of them came much later, but began to gain more preference. And also another major problem is that, a lot of these businesses began to outsource jobs. After China opened up, after the disastrous tenure of Mao Zedong and his successor Deng Xiaoping opened up the country to businesses, many of these companies began to form ties with China and actually outsource their, China is one of the many countries, but they basically outsource many of their their factories and their production, manufacturing to elsewhere. As a result, to make more profit and rely on more and cheap labor. And that's one of the driving forces behind American foreign policy, why they have gone to a lot of democratically elected countries in the global south and overthrown them, because these countries refuse to, at first, provide that kind of cheap labor, but then after they have been overthrown, deposed, and replaced with U.S. puppet states, they were able to U.S. puppet states or governments that were inclined to favor American interests, they were able to thrive and they were able to maintain their economic stability and position. So I guess one way to change would be the outsourcing of many manufacturing jobs. In fact, manufacturing has declined since the Second World War.
Thank you, sir.
No problem.
Hello.
Yes?
Hello, Mr. Pravin. I have a question.
Yes.
How post-war in America affected the youth or education? What is your opinion?
I mean, probably, I would say post-war, so you mean like young people and education-wise. So I would say education-wise, it probably affected the American youth, well, there was a big economic boom. It usually varies on demographics and race. White Americans were incredibly advantageous. They enjoyed incredible stability, went to very good schools in Harvard and other big prestigious universities, became very well off. It was mostly African Americans, Asian Americans, and other minorities that were not able to enjoy a lot of the post-World War II benefits that the U.S. enjoyed and were disproportionately affected by this. So, like I mentioned before, the General Motors, GM, which creates important cars like in India, such as Chevalier and so on and forth, actually ended up, and Dodge and so on and forth, I actually ended up only employed very few workers. In fact, one of the stats I put in the PowerPoint was 67 out of almost 11,000 workers were only African American. So examples like that. Education-wise, white Americans had more were able to have very good access to education. Meanwhile, African Americans and other minorities did not have, were disproportionately affected. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. I have a question.
Sure.
Does the 3 R's, reform, relief, and recovery that was focused during the Great Depression, does it still continue to help the American economy? And if yes, how?
Today, no. I would say no. In fact, I would say that both Democratic and Republican Party probably have gone away massively from the working class. Democratic Party in particular is very out of touch. The wealth gap between the rich and the wealthy and the poor have been disproportionately increasing since the post-World War. I guess many individuals decided to take FDR's reforms for granted and didn't work to keep them stability, or big business politicians who were backed by big business were able to chip away and slash funding for many of those programs that were focused on me, and whatever reforms were eventually, I believe, undone. But unfortunately, I haven't gone deeper into that because I usually study, medieval England is my main area of focus. But from what I've studied in terms of general American history, yes, many of FDR's reforms were eventually done away with. A good example would be a Glass-Steagall, which affected banking. That unfortunately, which was to regulate banks to prevent what had happened from happening, which had been one of the primary causes of the Great Depression to not happen again. But unfortunately, it was repealed a couple of years ago, and I haven't seen any attempt to bring it back.
Thank you, sir.
It was my pleasure.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
I have a question about the discrimination against minorities. After the war, there will be many leaders. There was many leaders who fought for the discrimination against the minorities. But
yes,
it seems like it's still here, still there. Could that change in future, or else it is better now?
I would say generally it would be better in terms of the U.S. Of course, we have had landmark cases, but I think one of your fellow students mentioned about Roe v. Wade being struck down. In terms of minorities have made a lot of advances since the Second World War. We're definitely not living in a post, 1950s world. However, the U.S., the conservative the Republican Party has attempted to do away with many important laws that have protected minorities. But despite that, the overall public opinion of many, such as the LGBT community, discrimination, and so on and forth, have become, the general public has, in terms of discrimination, minorities have been accepted in the court of public opinion, but but when it comes to legal challenges, there's still a lot to be done.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Any more questions?
Hello, hi, Mr. Praveen.
Hello.
So I would like to ask that what was the reactions of labor in post-war America?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What was the reactions of labor in post-war America?
In terms of labor, one of the ways that the U.S. became a global hegemon, especially during FDR's years, is that President Roosevelt put a lot of helped the working class tremendously by putting many people to work. We were the U.S. after 1945 produced 1/3 of the world's goods and was a major manufacturing machine. Unfortunately, we're not like that anymore. Many of these companies and businesses that thrived during those times have outsourced many of their jobs elsewhere to poorer and third world countries and have relied on cheap labor to make their products. In terms of labor, and of course, another sad part is that the labor movement, which was also very important in forcing President Roosevelt, because he came from a very wealthy family, to do and implement many of these reforms, was also slowly destroyed. Unfortunately, the labor movement is not as strong as it was back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. Any more questions?
I think it must be time for you to, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So I think we can wind up, and can I give them your email? If they have any further queries, they can send it to you?
Yes. If you can give them my school email, that would be
Sure, I'll do it. Or maybe you can put it in the chat box. They can.
Sure.
So the email is there in the chat box. Those of you who may have further queries can post it there for Mr. Praveen to answer. Is it visible to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
So please take it. Any feedback?
Neha Tasneem?
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm very delighted and grateful to you for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. I would like to express my humble thanks to you, Mr. Siddharth Praveen. You have provided us valuable knowledge in enriching our knowledge about post-World War America, giving us a realistic view, preparing us ahead to cope with our coursework. Your lecture serves as an apt introduction to American literature, enlightening our minds, giving us a new perspective of post-World War America. Your ideas and of excellence gave us an experience of our traveling to America. We truly believe that your speech will help us to plan our upcoming research project. My sincere thanks to our principal, Dr. S. Devi, our vice principal, Dr. R. Meenakshi, and Madam Deena Thomas, head of the postgraduate and research department of English, for giving us this wonderful opportunity. And thank you for responding to all our questions, Mr. Praveen. Thank you.
Of course. It's my pleasure. It's been a pleasure being this lecturer. Literature and history have a lot in common. In fact, when I was still in undergrad, my professor, literature professor for medieval literature, who was also, called Dr. Thomas, Carla Maria Thomas was her name, was a professor at the literature department at Florida Atlantic University. My final paper with her was actually on a historical historicity, on a historical topic as well. It had to do with one of the books that I had read in class. So I definitely, taking that medieval literature class not only helped me with my medieval history knowledge and research, it also made me realize that literature, English, and history have much more in common, and we should find more ways to find common ground.
That's great. So that note prompts me to ask, how much of literature do you read?
Oh, I read a lot of literature, but mostly I focus on, when it comes from the medieval period, I usually read primary source literature. So poems I have read, Beowulf, that's a very famous poem, Anglo-Saxon poem. Another one would be City of Women by Christine de Pizan, which was written in 1430 during the famous 100 Years' War, which is the conflict between Britain and France for the French throne. And of course, the book that I did my paper on was called The Song of the Cid, the famous El Cid, which was a Spanish knight known for fighting both with the Christian kingdoms of Spain as well as the Islamic. Because Spain had a major Islamic presence for a long time, and also fought with the Arabs from the Almohad Caliphate and the Almoravid Emirate as well. So I have written and read a lot of books similar to that, and it has inspired my history. I've watched also documentaries, and it has increased my love and knowledge for the medieval period. I feel like I find the medieval period, the Middle Ages overall, to be an important source of development for global society. However, I like to look at it not just from Europe, but also look at the East as well. China, India, the many kingdoms in India that thrived during this period also played important roles in learning, in terms of mathematics and other forms, which ultimately helped the world connect in the overall land route. And of course, the Islamic Golden Age, the beautiful city of Baghdad of the Abbasid Caliphate, was also a major port of learning, because many of these Islamic and Arabic historians actually translated and created important works of many classical thinkers such as Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and they also added their own takes. In fact, the famous Persian philosopher, Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi is best known for creating algorithms, which was one of the reasons for today, which also played a major role in the overall modern computers today. Or Ibn Haytham, who is responsible for for important stuffs in mathematics and other scientific fields. So all of that took place within the medieval period. So the Middle Ages I consider, was a recovery period for humanity after the classical age that ended with the fall of the Roman Empire. There's more interconnectivity between several cultures and so on and forth. And there's so much to study about and learn from this period.
That was a wonderful perspective. I think on that perspective, we should also go back to the medieval age, maybe to read up more and explore the present. So fantastic. Thank you wholeheartedly from my end too. A big thank you. Hope we have you again and again.
It would be my honor to
thank you. Yeah, best of luck to your course, and have a great day. We've started it very early.
Of course.
Have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Dr. Famida, you have anything to say? She's also sharing the course with me.
Okay.
Are you there, Famida?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Praveen. That was a wonderful lecture. It was really enthusing for students and very insightful. Thank you so much.
No problem. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Of course. Bye-bye.
Thank you, dear students. Thank you, all of you, for joining in. Meet you tomorrow.
Thank you, ma'am.